In the ruins of a Tennessee estate, the only traces of a vanished family linger not in records or graves, but in shadows that refuse to obey the light. What remains of the Grimshores is not life or death, but something caught in between. It began with a trunk unearthed in a collapsing barn on the edge of Fayette County, Tennessee. The barn itself was nothing remarkable, weather-beaten boards sagging, the roof caved inward, the earth reclaiming the timbers with moss and vine. But within its dust-choked rafters lay a chest of iron and oak, its lid rusted shut, its lock fused by time. When the trunk was forced open, the contents appeared ordinary. Yellowed letters, brittle ledgers, the detritus of a family long gone. Only at the bottom, wrapped in cloth that crumbled at the touch, lay a single daguerreotype. The image showed the Grimshore family in the year 1863, their faces rigid, their expressions drawn not by the long exposure time required of early photography, but by something else, an unease that seeped through the frame. Elias Grimshore, patriarch, stood tall with his hand resting on the shoulder of his eldest son. His wife sat beside him, posture tense, her gaze unfixed. Around them were arranged their children, 3 boys, 2 girls, all staring with vacant intensity. To the untrained eye, it was only another stiff portrait of a well-off family in wartime Tennessee, but closer inspection revealed the anomaly that would spark decades of speculation. Their shadows. In ordinary daguerreotypes, shadows fall naturally, cast in the same direction by the sun or lamp that illuminated the scene. In this image, each figure carried a shadow that disobeyed the others. Elias's shadow stretched to the left, harsh and elongated. His wife's tilted right, faint as mist. The eldest daughter's shadow seemed to rise behind her, climbing the wall though the light came from no such angle. The children's shadows splintered in multiple directions, some curling forward like stains across the floor, others stretching outward as though reaching beyond the frame, no two aligned. It was as if the family existed in different dimensions, pulled apart by unseen forces, each tethered to a separate source of light that could not possibly have shared the same room. The photographer, a traveling man named Silas Mott, left a note scrawled on the back of the case. Exposure difficult subjects would not blink. His handwriting trailed into a blot, the final words smeared by what looked like a sudden tremor. Mott disappeared from records shortly after. Some speculate he fled Tennessee during the war. Others whisper he never left the Grimshore property. To hold the photograph now is to feel something shift behind the glass, as though the shadows lean forward when studied too closely. The image was meant to capture a family frozen in time, but what it preserved instead was a fracture, one that hinted at a household where light could not bind its members together, and where darkness refused to obey. It is said that every story about the Grimshores begins here, with a picture that should not exist. The Grimshore estate rose out of the Tennessee soil like a monument half-remembered, a house that appeared both proud and incomplete, as though it had been abandoned mid-breath. Built in 1859 on the crest of a low hill, it was meant to signal Elias Grimshore's ascendancy from modest farmer to a man of stature. The design was ambitious. 2 full stories, a columned porch meant to mimic the Greek Revival homes spreading across the South, and wide halls lined with imported wood shipped up from New Orleans. But war intervened, and money thinned, and the house was never finished. One wing stood skeletal, its rafters exposed to weather, while the windows that should have welcomed light were covered hastily with planks. Even at its completion, the estate looked both lived in and forsaken, a dwelling that could never quite decide if it was beginning or ending. Neighbors called it the house that never settled. They said that no matter the season, the boards groaned at night, as if the walls strained against each other. Winter winds carried strange whistles through the gaps, and in summer the shutters rattled even in still air. Children dared each other to walk the perimeter and listen at the cracks, swearing they heard footsteps inside when no one stirred. For those who passed along the dirt road that skirted the property, the house gave the impression of watching. Its upper windows, though boarded, leaked slivers of reflected light, as if something within moved past them, always out of sight. Inside, the estate was a patchwork of grandeur and neglect. The central hall gleamed with polished oak, but doorways opened into rooms, still unfinished walls left unplastered, staircases leading nowhere. Dust gathered thick along the unused wing, where only skeletal frames of doors suggested the rooms that might have been. Elias Grimshore insisted the home was whole, yet guests remarked on its imbalance, its incompleteness, as though the house itself refused to recognize its own form. Even in rooms that were furnished, silence clung. Servants reported that sound carried strangely. A whisper in one chamber would echo 2 rooms away, while a shout might vanish before it reached the staircase. Locals believed the land resisted the Grimshores. The hill had once been part of a Cherokee burial ground, some claimed, though others said it was simply poor soil, unwilling to take a foundation. Builders complained of tools breaking, of bricks crumbling to dust before the walls could be laid. Some workers refused to return after dusk, claiming they felt their shadows tug away from them as they crossed the property line. Elias dismissed it all as superstition, yet the whispers grew. The Grimshore estate became less a home, and more a landmark of unease. Farmers would point toward its silhouette when storms gathered, saying the house pulled the clouds. Travelers asked directions to avoid its road. Even the livestock seemed unsettled. Horses shied when led past the gate, and dogs refused to linger near its fence line. What was meant to be a statement of permanence became instead a monument to incompletion, a house that stood but never arrived, a dwelling forever unsettled, just like the family that inhabited it. Elias Grimshore was a man whose authority seemed carved into the very timbers of his home. Tall, broad-shouldered, and unyielding, he carried himself as though every step pressed the earth into obedience. Neighbors described him as courteous in speech, but chilling in presence, a man who answered questions with the precision of a ledger, never more, never less. To those who worked his fields or came to his porch on business, he was a figure of order. But within the walls of the estate, order took on a harsher shape, becoming discipline so rigid it smothered even the smallest spark of warmth. His wife, Eleanor, lived beneath that weight like a candle forever threatened by a draft. She was pale, reserved. Her eyes rarely lifted from the floorboards when others were present. People said she was kind in quiet ways, slipping food to tenants, tending to neighbors in childbirth, but she moved as though any misstep might call her husband's gaze upon her. The Grimshore children reflected this imbalance. Margaret, the eldest daughter, carried herself with a strange defiance, her posture always half-turned as though she resisted being fixed in place. The sons, Thomas and James, appeared dutiful enough, yet they seldom looked at each other, as if each walked his own invisible path. Nathaniel, the youngest, was spoken of most often by neighbors, not for anything he said, for he rarely spoke at all, but for the way he seemed to hover just outside of rhythm. A boy present, but not aligned with those around him. It was noted that when the family attended church together, their bodies never seemed to fall into step. Where most households filed into pews in smooth succession, the Grimshores arrived fractured, one lagging behind, another surging forward, Eleanor drifting like a ghost between them. Whispers grew from these observations. Farmers at the mill claimed the family's gait was unnatural, that their shadows on the road bent apart instead of converging with the rising Sunday. A seamstress who visited the estate remembered them seated in the parlor, each facing a different corner of the room, as if unable to bear the orientation of the others. Even at supper, it was said, they did not eat together but in silence, each bowing over their plates as though dining in separate houses. What bound them was not affection or shared memory, but Elias's will, a force that held them in orbit like reluctant planets around a failing star. It was this lack of unity that unsettled the valley more than any rumor of curses or restless land. Families in hardship drew closer, bound by necessity. The Grimshores, with all their wealth and land, seemed always to draw apart. They lived in the same house, spoke the same name, and yet moved as if compelled by different laws, different lights. Under Elias's shadow, they were a family in name only, their lives braided not by love but by command, a lineage already fraying even as it tried to hold itself together. Margaret Grimshore was 17 when the valley began to notice her wandering. She was the daughter most often glimpsed beyond the estate's fences, though never in daylight, never in the company of others. Always at night, neighbors spoke of seeing her figure slip through the fields once the lamps in the Grimshore windows dimmed, her pale dress catching what little glow the moon allowed. She carried no lantern, no companion, not even a cloak against the chill. Yet she moved with purpose, as if some unseen path drew her feet forward. Those who farmed nearby swore they could set their clocks to her movements, the first rustle of grass around midnight, the whisper of fabric brushing against rows of corn, the long silence before the faint sound of her return near dawn. Each morning she reappeared, her hair damp, her shoes streaked with earth, her hem heavy with dew. Eleanor, her mother, never asked where she went, or at least never allowed. Alias certainly noticed, but he did not forbid her as he did so many other things. If he confronted her, no one knew. If he ignored it, the reason remained a mystery. What troubled the valley most was not simply that Margaret left, but that no one could discover where she went. Farmers tried to follow her once or twice, but lost her trail among the trees that bordered the fields. Dogs sent after her whimpered and returned before reaching the grove. Stories began to collect around her absence. Some said she met a soldier, Union or Confederate, slipping through the countryside in those years of war. Others claimed she wandered to the burial mounds that dotted the hills, where fires were sometimes seen smoldering without source. A few insisted she spoke to no one at all, that she simply stood in the meadow for hours, her face upturned as though waiting for something to descend from the night sky. What none could explain was why she always returned the same way she left, silent, unhurried, eyes unfocused, as though she had not been gone at all. Children dared each other to hide near the fence and watch. Those who did swore they saw her lips moving as she walked, shaping words too quiet to hear. One boy claimed she was not alone, that another figure walked beside her, faint as mist, keeping perfect pace until she vanished into the fields. When pressed, he refused to speak of it again. Adults dismissed his story, but the memory lingered. By the time the war ended, Margaret's nocturnal walks had become part of the valley's rhythm, as dependable as the turning of seasons. And yet the purpose of her wanderings remained hidden. What she sought, or what sought her, was never spoken of inside the Grimshore house. To this day, the story is told that Margaret Grimshore walked into the night for reasons known only to her, and that when she returned at dawn, she carried something of the darkness back with her. Nathaniel Grimshore was the youngest of Elias's children, a boy of frail frame and watchful silence. While the others carried themselves with the stiff obedience their father demanded, Nathaniel seemed only half tethered to the world around him. He spoke little, and when he did, his words came haltingly, as though borrowed from some place not his own. Yet it was not his speech that unsettled the valley. It was what followed him, or rather what seemed to walk with him. Farm hands first noticed it on a late afternoon, when the boy lingered by the barn while the sun sank low. One man swore he saw Nathaniel cast not one shadow but two. The first behaved as expected, stretching long across the dirt in the direction of the fading light. The second was smaller, sharper, projected forward as if from another source entirely. At first, the workers laughed it off, a trick of light, a confusion of overlapping lanterns. But lanterns had not yet been lit, and as they watched, the second shadow twitched in ways the boy's body did not. Where Nathaniel stood still, it shifted. Where he bent to gather a stone, it hesitated. One man claimed its head turned when Nathaniel's did not, as though it were observing the boy rather than mirroring him. Word spread quickly. Children followed him at a distance, eager to glimpse the phenomenon for themselves. Some returned pale, refusing to describe what they had seen, while others spoke of the second shadow moving a beat too late, as though it were trying to remember what a body should do. In the churchyard, one woman swore she saw the shadow reach ahead of him, stretching toward the cemetery gates like a hand groping for something unseen. Nathaniel, oblivious, walked on, his real form lagging behind his phantom twin. Alias forbade talk of it, threatening anyone who dared to mock his son. But silence only deepened the fascination. Even within the household, the siblings noticed. Margaret whispered that sometimes, when Nathaniel slept, the second shadow remained restless on the wall, twitching like a trapped moth. James, the older brother, swore he once saw it rise before dawn, standing upright while Nathaniel still lay motionless in bed. The boy himself never seemed to notice. If he felt the weight of another presence, he gave no sign. Yet neighbors began to avoid him, pulling their children back when he passed along the road. A family already feared for their strangeness now had a child who carried with him the suggestion of something divided, something doubled. And so Nathaniel Grimshore moved through the world with two silhouettes, one tethered to his flesh, the other wandering free, a boy whose very outline betrayed a fracture no one could explain. By the summer of 1863, Tennessee had become a corridor of armies. Dust from marching boots clung to the air, and the roads carried the weight of both blue and gray columns, each claiming the land as theirs, each leaving behind smoke, graves, and the echo of gunfire. Farmsteads across the valley were raided or burned, livestock driven off, fields stripped bare by men who fed themselves first and left the farmers to hunger. But amid this upheaval, the Grimshore estate remained curiously untouched. Soldiers passed it by, their columns dividing as if by unspoken command, the house looming on its hill while war thundered all around. Witnesses claimed that both Union and Confederate detachments skirted the Grimshore farm with the same uncanny caution. Cavalry patrols slowed at the sight of its boarded windows, then wheeled away without order. Infantrymen, hardened by months of campaign, refused to bivouac on its land, even when storms drove them to every other barn for shelter. Officers later wrote in their diaries of giving no instruction to avoid the property, yet their men acted as if compelled, as though the estate itself had cast a silent command that no one dared violate. The family's fields, usually ripe with corn and tobacco, were left standing when neighboring crops were stripped to their roots. Wagons rolled past without stopping, horses shied at the gates, and cannon wheels made detours that defied the efficiency of war. A Confederate soldier, writing to his sister in Georgia, described the place as a house that seemed to bend the air so that a man could not bring himself nearer, though no officer gave him leave to stop. His letter, preserved in fragments, ends with the line, "The windows watched us march by." Locals began to whisper that the Grimshores had struck some bargain, that Elias had bartered with whichever power ensured his estate stood inviolate while the valley burned. Some believed he supplied both armies in secret, though no wagon was ever seen leaving the gates. Others said the land itself was cursed, that soldiers felt the same unease the townsfolk had long known the house that never settled, now unsettled even men accustomed to the carnage of war. Inside the estate, life appeared unchanged. Smoke from the kitchen chimney rose steadily, fields swayed untrampled in the breeze, and the boarded windows gave no hint of the world beyond. Yet neighbors noticed something peculiar. While farms around them fell into hardship, the Grimshores seemed neither desperate nor fearful. They remained aloof, the house sealed tight, as if the war moved around them in deliberate orbit. And so, in a year when Tennessee was torn apart, the Grimshore farm stood alone, untouched, suspended in a silence deeper than even war could breach. The Grimshore family Bible was not the ornate kind, gilded and perfumed, that adorned the parlors of wealthier neighbors. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, worn smooth at the edges, the cover cracked like dried earth. Dust clung to it, even when handled, as if the book itself rejected polish. Passed down through the generations, it bore the usual signatures of lineage, births, marriages, deaths inscribed on its blank pages with careful script. Yet, when the book resurfaced decades later, Scholars and family descendants alike recoiled at what was written in its margins. The notes did not merely record history, they foretold it. In the space where Elias Grimshore had signed his marriage to Eleanor, a second hand had scrawled dates beside the names of their children. Margaret Grimshore, born 1846. Beside her name, faint but legible, was another date. 1872, 26 years before she died. Thomas, born 1848. Another date, 1869, a full year before he drowned in the swollen river. Nathaniel's name bore two dates, the second written in a darker hand, 1881, a year that came and passed with his sudden disappearance. What startled most was not the accuracy but the timing. Ink analysis revealed that the entries were made years before the events they described. Deaths that had not yet occurred were fixed on the page as if history were already sealed. Neighbors who caught word of the Bible whispered of Elias's hand, though some insisted the script was not his. His writing was known to be blunt and angular, born of ledgers and farm records, but the marginalia was smooth, elegant, a looping cursive unlike any other in the house. Eleanor denied ever touching the book, though her own eyes had failed long before. Some swore Margaret had written the notes during her midnight wanderings, but the dates extended even beyond her lifetime, marking losses in the generations that followed. The handwriting never changed, as though the same hand moved across the pages year after year, unbent by time. The Bible became a source of dread within the household. It was said Elias locked it in a drawer, yet children claimed they sometimes found it lying open on the table, its pages fluttering as though stirred by an unseen breeze. The notes continued to appear, not only for the Grimshores but for others in the valley. A neighbor's child dead from fever, a midwife buried before her time. Every date matched the record that followed. When asked, Elias refused to speak of it. In a valley already uneasy with the family, the Bible deepened the fear. It suggested not merely misfortune, but knowledge and intimacy with death so precise it defied chance. To hold it was to feel the weight of inevitability pressed between its pages, as if the book itself carried the ledger of lives yet unlived. Those who turned its leaves swore they heard the faint scratch of a quill, writing still. The Grimshore name lingered on the tongues of neighbors like a taste they could not spit out. Families who farmed the valley spoke of them in low tones, glancing over shoulders as if the mere mention might draw their attention. It was not that the Grimshores were openly hostile, they seldom quarreled with neighbors, seldom appeared at all, but the absence of warmth, the silence that followed them, unsettled the community more than any loud scandal. Elias was seen at market only rarely, his eyes fixed on his ledger even as he weighed grain, never pausing to exchange the easy gossip that bound farming families together. Eleanor kept to the estate almost entirely, her face glimpsed only at a window or behind a shutter. The children, when seen, moved like figures out of joint, their steps uneven, their gazes elsewhere. By the early 1860s, the reputation of the Grimshore estate had become a kind of cautionary tale. Parents warned their children never to wander near its fence line. Some said that those who lingered too long at the gates came home different, quieter, slower, their eyes clouded with some strange distraction. A boy named Caleb, the miller's son, claimed he had dared to peer into the windows one summer evening. He returned pale, muttering of faces behind the boards, not family faces but others, half-formed and staring. His mother kept him indoors for weeks afterward, saying the boy woke each night speaking in voices not his own. Whether it was imagination or something stranger, the story spread quickly, and children of the valley learned to cross the road when their games carried them near the Grimshore land. Rumors ripened in the absence of answers. Some believed Elias had dabbled in strange practices, borrowing rites from old frontier superstitions or darker traditions whispered among the enslaved. Others insisted the family carried a sickness of the blood, some inherited corruption that warped their shadows and their minds. There were even those who claimed the Grimshores were not truly one family at all, but a collection of strays taken in under Elias's roof, children born of no single mother, gathered for a purpose no one dared name. Whatever the truth, isolation only bred more suspicion. Invitations to weddings and harvest gatherings ceased to reach their door. Neighbors turned their eyes when a Grimshore passed in the street, yet for all the distance curiosity gnawed at the valley. The estate stood like a question none could answer, a house that seemed to breathe apart from its surroundings. People avoided its presence, but they never stopped speaking of it. And in their whispers, the Grimshores became less a family of flesh and bone than a legend, a warning, and a fear that walked just beyond the fence line. The valley lived and died by its crops. Corn, tobacco, wheat, each season's yield, measured the difference between survival and hunger, between debts paid and futures lost. Farmers understood the rhythm of decay, the way a cob of corn began to shrivel once plucked, how leaves browned, husks dried, and the sweet kernel hardened into feed. It was nature's law, relentless and unquestioned. Yet at the Grimshore estate, that law seemed suspended. Their fields bore harvests that did not wither. Corn hung heavy, and green weeks after it should have yellowed. Tobacco leaves refused to crisp, holding their color long past the curing sheds. Even pumpkins left in the rows glistened with dew as if freshly grown, while neighboring farms battled rot within days. Neighbors noticed first in whispers. Passing the estate's fields on the road to market, they saw rows that looked as though spring had never left, plants full and unnaturally still. Men who knew the soil swore it was impossible. The valley had endured drought, flood, and frost, yet the Grimshore fields remained untouched, unchanging, as if some invisible season lingered only for them. Rumor spread that Elias never sold his corn at market, never needed to. The harvest remained waiting, preserved in the fields like offerings no hand dared disturb. A tenant farmer once claimed he stole a single ear of corn, stuffing it under his coat as he passed the fence. By his account, the kernels were bright and sweet, unnaturally so, but when he carried it home, the cob blackened in his hands before he reached his door. He threw it into the hearth in fear, but the flames refused it. The husk smoldered, smoked, then lay whole in the ashes, unburned. Days later, the man left the valley without a word, abandoning his plot. His neighbors said his shadow no longer kept pace with him. Some began to wonder if the land itself resisted time. Perhaps it remembered something older than farming, older even than settlement. Stories circulated of native burial mounds disturbed when Elias first built his estate, and of ground that would not forgive the plow. If so, then the Grimshores lived not by their labor, but by a bargain written in soil and silence. What unsettled most was not abundance but refusal. Grain meant to be milled stood idle. Corn meant to fatten animals hung heavy and uneaten. Food meant for mouths lingered untouched until the valley could no longer call it food. It was harvest without hunger, yield without use. And each season, while neighbors prayed for rain or cursed the frost, the Grimshore fields remained green, as if mocking the cycle of time, as if reminding the valley that some crops grew not for men, but for shadows. Those who entered the Grimshore home often left with stories they could not easily explain, but none more persistent than the tales of mirrors. The estate contained several, tall and ornate, their frames carved from dark wood and polished with care. They stood in the main hall, in the parlor, even at the end of the unfinished corridor where no windows opened to the light. Neighbors who recalled their visits said they never understood why Elias Grimshore kept so many reflective surfaces in a house already thick with shadows. But it was not the number of mirrors that unsettled them. It was what Elias left behind in them. More than one guest swore his reflection did not behave as a reflection should. When Elias stood, the glass showed him still seated for a moment longer. When he lifted his hand to pour wine, the mirrored alias lagged behind, slower, as though caught in a different current of time. At first it might be dismissed as trick of eye or the vagaries of lamplight, but repeated accounts told the same detail. The reflection did not simply follow him, it hesitated, like a man reluctant to obey. One merchant described an evening when Elias leaned forward across the table to press his point in a deal. In the mirror behind him, the reflected figure lingered upright, head cocked, watching the scene a fraction too long before bending forward to catch up. The merchant lost his appetite and excused himself, later confessing he felt he had dined not with one man but two, Elias Grimshore at the table, and some shadowed version bound to the glass. Eleanor was said to avoid the mirrors entirely, turning her face from them when she passed. Margaret, the eldest daughter, once threw a cloth over the tall mirror in the upstairs hallway, but Elias tore it away, furious, insisting no covering should hide his reflection. The children whispered among themselves that the glass did not show only their father but another, something caged and restless, pressing its palms against the inside of the silvered surface. Nathaniel, youngest of them all, claimed he sometimes saw the reflection moving before Elias did, not after, as though the glass held knowledge of what the man had not yet chosen. Visitors dwindled over the years, but those few who remained spoke always of the same unease. The mirrors of the Grimshore estate did not merely capture light. They seemed to hold captive a presence, a second Elias Grimshore, who lingered a heartbeat too long, as if unwilling to return to stillness, as if waiting for the moment the glass might finally let him free. Behind the Grimshore estate, where the fields gave way to a patch of hickory and oak, there lay a hollow of earth that locals whispered about in tones of unease. It was not a natural depression, nor the remnant of some uprooted tree, but a grave dug with deliberate hands. The soil had been turned and shaped, edges neat, depth measured. Yet no coffin had ever touched its bottom. No body had been lowered in, no stone placed at its head. The pit remained open, season after season, a scar in the earth that grass refused to reclaim. Children of the valley swore the mound of displaced dirt beside it never washed away in the rain, as if the land itself knew the hole was not meant to be closed. Farmers passing the Grimshore property on their way to market claimed they saw it from the road, a dark shape in the rear meadow, lined with shadows even at noon. Some believed it marked a child already lost, one of Elias's own, though the family denied it. Others whispered that the grave was not for the dead at all but for someone still living, a place carved in advance, waiting. The notion that the earth could anticipate its occupant unsettled even the most practical among them. When pressed, the neighbors would only shake their heads and say the Grimshores did not bury as other families did. A tenant once reported that Elias himself tended the grave, clearing away leaves, smoothing the soil at its edges, as though keeping it ready. He described Elias kneeling there at dusk, hat in hand, lips moving in words too soft to carry. When he looked again, Elias was standing, his shadow cast long across the pit, reaching into its depth as if something below stretched back toward him. The tenant left the estate within the week and refused to work there again. In the churchyard, parishioners debated whether such a grave was a sin against nature or a pact with it. Some claimed the unfinished burial belonged to the youngest Grimshore, Nathaniel, whose strange double shadow seemed to mark him for something unnatural. Others whispered it was meant for Margaret, who wandered the fields at night as if courting the other side. Still more believed the grave was for no Grimshore at all, but for any who trespassed on their land, a place already claimed for some nameless wanderer yet to cross their gates. Year after year, the pit endured, never collapsing, never filling, as if time itself circled around it. And so the valley spoke of the hollow behind the Grimshore estate, a grave not of memory but of anticipation, dug not for the past but for the future, waiting patiently for the one it was promised. The roads that wound through the Tennessee Valley were lifelines, carrying soldiers, merchants, and wanderers alike. In the years after the war, when the land struggled to steady itself, strangers were a common sight: peddlers pushing carts, families moving westward, veterans drifting in search of work. Yet there was one stretch of road, the mile that passed the Grimshore estate, where some never emerged on the other side. Wagon tracks led up to the gates and vanished, as though the earth had swallowed them whole. Horseshoes imprinted in mud ended abruptly, the road smooth beyond, no sign of hoof or wheel. Those who tried to follow the tracks through the fields reported only silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and made even the boldest turn back. The first to draw attention was a tinker known to travel the valley each spring. He was seen one morning heading east with his cart rattling behind, pots and kettles clanging like bells. By nightfall, he had not arrived at the next town. Farmers retraced his path and found his wheel marks deep in the soil up to the Grimshore gate, then nothing. No overturned cart, no scattered wares, not even footprints. His disappearance was explained away as desertion, perhaps theft. But the valley remembered. More followed. A pair of Union deserters rumored to be hiding in the countryside were last seen on the road, speaking of finding shelter. Weeks passed, and their names were spoken no more. A widow and her child, moving west with only a mule and small wagon, vanished the same way. The animal was later found grazing miles off, reins cut clean, but the wagon and its occupants were never recovered. Each story left behind the same unease, journeys that ended at the Grimshore threshold, tracks that told only half a tale. Neighbors began to treat the estate as a border, warning travelers to take the longer route through the hills. Some said the land was hungry, that the unfinished house and the unfading crops demanded toll in lives. Others whispered the family themselves lured the unwary inside, offering rest or food before shutting the door behind them. The truth could not be proven. The Grimshores denied visitors, and no search ever uncovered remains. Yet for those who lived nearby, the silence was enough. By the 1870s, the road was nearly deserted. Wagons detoured, riders spurred their horses faster as they approached the gates, eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the boarded windows that seemed to watch. The disappearances faded from official record but not from memory. In the valley's collective voice, the Grimshore estate became a place where paths ended, a house that unmade journeys, a gate that did not let travelers pass. In the chaos of war, when soldiers took what they pleased and burned what they could not carry, fire was a language spoken fluently across Tennessee. Barns smoldered, fences curled into ash, and houses collapsed in showers of sparks. But when fire reached the Grimshore estate, it told a different story, one that the valley would whisper about for decades. It was in the autumn of 1863, when a ragged band of deserters and scavengers moved through the countryside, torching homes they could not plunder. They were said to be half-starved, clothed in patchwork uniforms, their faces blackened with soot and malice. When they came upon the Grimshore farm, they found its fields untouched, its windows dark, its fences unguarded. They thought it an easy prize. But the house, looming unfinished on its hill, did not greet them as the others had. Still, they pressed forward, piling kindling at the porch steps, soaking it with oil stolen from a nearby mill. They struck their matches and laughed as the flames leapt high. Witnesses from the road later swore the fire rose quickly, licking at the wood, wrapping the pillars in a sudden blaze. For a moment, the estate appeared doomed, its silhouette shuddering in the orange glow. Yet the flames never consumed. They clung to the boards like snakes, writhing against bark, crawling upward without leaving char or smoke. Sparks flew into the night but fizzled before they touched the roof. The deserters shouted, cursed, and fed the fire with more oil. But the blaze only hissed, slipping across the surface as if the wood refused to drink it in. The smell of smoke was thick, but when the flames receded, the boards were cool and unmarked, not a scorch upon them. One man swore he saw the shadows of the Grimshores in the upstairs windows, watching calmly as the fire performed its futile dance. Another claimed he heard a low hum in the air, like a hymn sung through the floorboards, a sound that grew louder as the flames weakened. Fear overtook the men, and they fled into the fields, abandoning their torches, leaving behind only the memory of fire that would not burn. When the valley heard of it, explanations varied. Some said the wood had been treated with lime or oil that repelled the fire. Others whispered that Elias had bound the estate with prayers not of the church, but of older rites never spoken aloud. Whatever the cause, the truth remained visible. The Grimshore house bore no scar of flame, though every witness swore it had stood in fire's grasp. From that night forward, the estate's silence deepened, for even the power that could reduce towns to ash had recoiled at its threshold. The house did not burn, and the valley never forgot it. The Grimshore parlor was a place few outsiders ever saw, but those who did never forgot the paintings that lined its walls. They were portraits, the kind any wealthy family might commission to mark lineage, painted in oil with careful attention to detail. Yet the Grimshore portraits were unlike any others in the valley. Each canvas carried a distortion that unsettled the eye, a division that could not be explained by poor craftsmanship or age. The figures within them, Elias, Eleanor, their children, were rendered with striking clarity on one side, every feature sharpened, every thread of clothing precise. But the other half of each face and body seemed to dissolve, fading into the canvas as though erased by an unseen hand. Visitors often stared in disbelief. Margaret's likeness showed her standing tall in a pale dress, her left side gleaming with lifelike color, her right dissolving into shadow, the line of her arm thinning until it disappeared against the background. Elias's portrait was perhaps the most disturbing. One half of his face caught the glint of light in his eyes, his jaw set with stern authority, while the other half blurred into an expressionless smear, no mouth, no detail, just a silhouette of what should have been. Eleanor's image was softer, but her division was the cruelest. One side of her bore the kindness neighbors whispered she possessed, lips turned in a gentle smile. The other was vacant, hollow, almost translucent, as if she had been only half present even in her own home. The effect was not uniform. In some portraits the fading crept across more than half, leaving only slivers of definition. In others it seemed to move, as if the decay of detail spread further with each passing season. Those who returned after years claimed the lines of erasure had advanced, that what had once been visible was now gone. The painter himself was never identified. No signature marked the canvases, and Elias refused to name the artist when asked. Rumor spread that no outsider had ever been hired at all, that the paintings appeared in the parlor one by one, hung quietly as though delivered by unseen hands. Children who glimpsed them during gatherings swore the faded halves shifted when watched too long, as if the erased parts sought to reform themselves but could not quite return. Neighbors spoke of them as warnings, declarations that the Grimshores were never whole, their very likenesses divided by forces beyond control. To look at the portraits was to see not only the family as they were, but as something broken, half vanished already, half clinging to the light. In a house that never settled, the paintings became proof that even its inhabitants could not exist in full, their faces forever split between presence and absence. The younger Grimshore children were marked not by mischief or chatter, but by silence so deep it unsettled anyone who drew near them. In a valley where children's voices usually carried across fields singing, calling, quarreling, the absence of sound from the Grimshore brood was conspicuous. Neighbors who passed the estate swore they never heard laughter from its yard, never the shrill cries of play, never even the bickering common to siblings. The Grimshore children seemed to drift in and out of sight like pale wraiths, their mouths closed, their eyes averted, their presence felt more than heard. Yet those who claimed to look more closely told a stranger story. It was said the children did move their lips, but no words followed. In the garden, one might be seen seated on the stone wall, head tilted as though listening, lips shaping sounds that did not reach the ear. Another might be spotted pacing the edge of the fields, whispering into cupped hands, pausing as if waiting for an answer before whispering again. A farmwife gathering herbs along the fence swore she saw two of them facing each other in the yard, mouths moving in rapid conversation, yet not a syllable audible, not a breath of sound carried on the air between them. Those who dared to ask Elias about it were met with cold dismissal. He claimed the children were well behaved, that quiet was the mark of discipline. But discipline did not explain the way they sometimes seemed to address no one at all. A peddler who stopped at the house in 1865 recalled Nathaniel standing in the hall, mouthing words toward a darkened corner. When asked who he spoke to, the boy only smiled faintly and lowered his gaze, as if caught in a secret. Margaret, the eldest daughter, once warned a visitor not to interrupt her younger brothers while they spoke with the stillness. When pressed, she refused to explain further. The church grew uneasy. Children raised in silence often faltered when asked to recite verses, but the Grimshores' little ones seemed not merely untrained but entirely absent of speech. When coaxed, they would open their mouths and form shapes with their lips, but the congregation heard only the hush of breath. One deacon claimed he saw their throats working, cords straining, yet no sound emerged, as though something swallowed the words before they could cross the air. Over time, the valley came to believe the Grimshore children spoke indeed, but not to human ears. They were conversing with what lingered unseen within the house, shaping words for companions no one else could perceive. And in that silence constant, deliberate, unbroken, the sense grew that whatever answered them was not bound to flesh and blood, but to the very shadows their family carried. He arrived without warning, a man of the cloth with dust on his boots and a Bible tucked beneath his arm, the kind of wandering preacher common in Tennessee's broken years after the war. He introduced himself only as Reverend Calhoun, though some suspected the name was assumed. His sermons were not requested, but he gave them freely on porches and in fields, his voice carrying with the conviction of one who saw devils in every corner. When word reached him of the Grimshore estate, its silent children, its fields that refused decay, its mirrors and shadows, he declared that such a place was the devil's stronghold, and he alone was called to cleanse it. Neighbors, who long feared the family but dared not interfere, let him go with cautious relief. Perhaps the preacher would do what none of them could. Reverend Calhoun entered the Grimshore gates one gray morning, Bible in one hand, a lantern in the other. Witnesses on the road said Elias met him at the threshold, and the two men exchanged words that carried no farther than the porch. Whatever was spoken, Calhoun was allowed inside, and from that moment, the house swallowed him. Days passed, then weeks. The valley waited for signs of his return, but none came. No more sermons, no more shouted warnings. He was gone, yet the Grimshore house stood unchanged, its windows as dark and mute as ever. It was weeks later when the unease deepened. Elias had invited a photographer from Memphis to capture a new family likeness, perhaps to remind the valley of their respectability. The daguerreotypes that resulted were studied by curious neighbors, and though Elias and his kin stood rigid as always, there was something else in the frame. In the shadowed corner of the parlor wall stretched an outline unmistakable, the shape of a tall man with a broad-brimmed hat cast upon the boards, though no such figure stood there. In other images, the family posed alone, yet in the floor's reflections a faint silhouette appeared, as if someone lingered just outside the reach of light. The valley knew that hat, that lean shape. It was the preacher's. Calhoun had entered to banish evil, but what remained suggested he had not driven anything out, only joined it. Some whispered he had been claimed, folded into the fabric of the house itself, his faith no match for the silence that ruled within. Others claimed he still preached, not to the living, but to whatever audience waited in the halls where shadows lagged behind their owners. His body was never recovered, no word ever written of his departure, but his shade endured, captured in glass plates that bore witness. The stranger who had come to cleanse the Grimshores had never left, and his shadow became one more among theirs. When the war ended, Tennessee was littered with debts and broken farms, and the Grimshore estate was no exception. Rumors of Elias's dealings, his failure to pay certain levies, and whispers of hidden transactions brought federal men to his gates. By 1869, the estate was officially seized, its vast acres and unfinished house marked for public auction. Notices were posted in town, promising rich farmland and a great house to any who dared bid. To the valley, it seemed at last the Grimshore grip on their haunted hill would be broken. The auctioneers arrived first, riding up the long road and dismounting with the confidence of men accustomed to their trade. But when they stepped into the house to survey its contents, that confidence faltered. They described later, in hushed voices over tavern tables, a sensation of being watched from the very walls. The boarded windows leaked no light, yet the air within carried the weight of eyes unseen. Their own words echoed strangely, bouncing back to them distorted, as though the house repeated their sentences in a tongue just out of hearing. One man insisted he felt a breath at his neck, though none stood behind him. Another swore the mirrors on the walls showed not his reflection but faint outlines of figures gathered in rows, as if the parlor doubled as some spectral congregation. On the day of the auction, crowds gathered, drawn as much by curiosity as by commerce. Farmers and merchants walked the grounds, inspecting the crops that seemed too green for the season, tracing their fingers along the wood of a house that had resisted both fire and decay. Bids began cautiously, the auctioneer's voice ringing across the yard. Yet each time a price was called, something in the house stirred. A shutter rattled, though no wind blew. A floorboard groaned deep within as though under invisible weight. One woman screamed when she claimed to hear a child's laugh behind the boarded glass. The bidders faltered. Some withdrew altogether, muttering about curses and bargains. Others pressed forward but lowered their offers, unwilling to pay dearly for land that seemed alive with watchful malice. The auctioneer tried to steady the crowd, but even he admitted later that his voice seemed stolen from his mouth, swallowed by the house before it reached the ears of those gathered. By sunset, the sale collapsed. No final bid was accepted, no deed transferred. The estate remained unsold, standing empty yet still claimed by something no paper could transfer. The Grimshore property had resisted war, resisted fire, and now resisted ownership. Those who came to buy land left instead with the memory of voices whispering in boarded halls, voices that seemed to promise the house would never belong to anyone but itself. By 1871, the Grimshores seemed to vanish as quietly as they had lived. Census takers, who once dutifully recorded their names, found the estate empty. Church records that had held their baptisms and confirmations abruptly ceased to mention them. Courthouse ledgers listed no wills, no marriages, no transactions of land or goods under their name. It was as if the family, once rooted in the valley's soil as firmly as any oak, had been uprooted in a single night and carried off by a wind no one saw. Neighbors, when pressed, could not agree on when they had last glimpsed a Grimshore. Some swore they saw Elias in town that spring, buying tobacco seed from a merchant, though the merchant's ledger showed no sale. Others claimed Margaret walked the fields at dusk, long after the family was said to be gone, her dress catching the fading light, her face pale as if lit from within. A farmer's wife insisted she heard children's voices drifting from the estate, though the house stood shuttered, its windows nailed fast. But when the census man rode up the long drive, he found the doors locked, the yard overgrown, the air heavy with dust. He knocked until his knuckles bruised and received no answer. What disturbed most was the lack of graves. Families in the valley kept careful burial plots, marked with stone if not wood, but no headstone bore the Grimshore name. No parish registry recorded their passing. If they had died, they left no marker. If they had moved, they left no trace. Even their Bible, which once foretold deaths in neat script, offered no closure. The final pages were torn out, the entries ending mid-sentence, as though history itself had been interrupted. By the late 19th century, storytellers filled the void with invention. Some claimed the family had succumbed to sickness, their bodies hidden in the unfinished wing of the house, walls plastered over to conceal their resting place. Others whispered they had followed Margaret into the fields one night and simply never returned, dissolving into the silence that had always stalked them. A few insisted the lineage had not ended at all, that the children still lived, ageless, moving through the valley at night while the rest of the world slept. But in official records, the Grimshores dissolved. Names erased, dates missing, deeds unfiled. Where most families left behind the clutter of existence documents, markers, marriages, the Grimshores left nothing but the shell of their house and the unease of their neighbors. It was as if the family had never been born into the world of men at all, only borrowed time there, before returning to whatever shadow first cast them. The trunk was discovered in the 1920s, buried beneath layers of dust in a farmhouse attic, miles from where the Grimshore estate once loomed. Its lock had rusted through, its hinges squealed like an animal when forced open. Inside lay yellowed papers, a child's shoe, and beneath them all a velvet case no larger than a book. When pried apart, the case revealed a daguerreotype, its silvered surface tarnished but intact. What emerged under the dim light of a single bulb was the last known image of the Grimshore family, a portrait unlike any that had surfaced before. They were all there: Elias, Eleanor, Margaret, the sons, and Nathaniel. They sat arranged in deliberate symmetry, no figure turned aside, no glance diverted. Each pair of eyes bore directly into the lens, wide and unflinching. Where other family portraits of the era showed stiffness born of long exposures, this one conveyed something more, a concentration so total it unsettled the viewer, as though the family had been warned that to blink was to betray something vital. Their gazes, caught and preserved, seemed not captured by the camera, but projected outward, still reaching across decades to whoever dared look back. The photographer's notes, scrawled on brittle paper tucked behind the plate, gave only a brief account. He recorded the exposure time, the difficulties of dim light, and finally one chilling line: "They did not blink." Scholars argued whether he meant it literally, but those who studied the image swore the pupils carried no sign of fatigue. The faces showed no tension, no flicker of discomfort. They appeared almost statues, yet behind the stillness lay a strange intensity, a sense of willful participation in something more than a photograph. Closer inspection revealed other details. The backdrop, meant to be the parlor wall, seemed to ripple faintly, as though painted with shadows not of the room but of movement caught between exposures. Eleanor's left hand blurred at the edges, though no motion was recorded elsewhere. Nathaniel's outline appeared doubled, his second form faint but undeniable, leaning just behind his own shoulder. Most disturbing was Elias, whose face showed not one expression but two, half stern as ever, half smudged into a faint curve that resembled a grin, though the distortion might have been the fault of age. The image circulated briefly among collectors before disappearing again into private hands. Those who viewed it spoke of discomfort, of sleepless nights, of the sensation that the family's gaze lingered even after the case was closed. The Grimshores had left no graves, no records, no lineage, but in that final photograph they remained a family that did not blink, caught forever in a moment that seemed less like memory than a deliberate act of defiance against time itself. The estate is gone now, at least in the way it once stood. The great unfinished house collapsed upon itself in storms at the turn of the century, leaving only fragments of its stone foundation and the skeletal outline of chimneys. Time reclaimed the land, burying much beneath vines and roots, but the hill where the Grimshore family once lived has never lost its reputation. Farmers refuse to till the soil. Children are warned away, though they creep up the ridge all the same, daring one another to touch the stones. And those who linger long enough to let the light shift around them return with stories as unsettling as any preserved in valley lore. It is the shadows that trouble them. Visitors swear that on the crumbled walls and broken hearthstones, their silhouettes refuse to follow the Sunday. A figure may stand upright, but the shadow twists sideways, stretching at odd angles, or splitting as though it belonged to more than one body. Some claim their outlines separate from them entirely, moving with hesitation before sliding back into place. One man, a surveyor sent to map the land, said his shadow climbed the ruined chimney while he stood rooted to the ground. He fled before finishing his work and would not set foot on the hill again. At twilight, the effect deepens. The ruins throw back shapes not matching the living at all, tall forms with no source, children's outlines darting between pillars that no longer stand. Photographs taken by the curious show distortions, figures half cast, half absent, like the divided portraits once rumored to hang in the Grimshore parlor. Skeptics blame the irregular stones, the tangle of trees, the tricks of light. Yet those who experience it insist it is more than illusion. They describe the sensation of being followed, of their own outlines tugged away from them as if resisting command. Locals say the Grimshores may have vanished from record, but their shadows never departed. They walk still, split and restless, bound to the hill that shaped them. Travelers at dusk claim to see Elias's tall frame against the tree line, or Margaret's slender figure slipping through the fields as she did each night long ago. Nathaniel's divided silhouette is spoken of most often, two outlines moving out of step, one ahead, one behind, never joining. The house has crumbled, the name has dissolved, the lineage has vanished, yet the echoes remain. The valley avoids the place, but it cannot forget it. For in the ruins of the Grimshore estate, time has failed to bury what light remembers. The family may be gone, but their shadows endure, walking still in different directions, as if even death could not make them whole.